In the unforgiving wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, where ancient spirits roam and tribal laws still echo through canyon winds, one woman's act of mercy would challenge everything she believed about survival, loyalty, and the invisible threads that bind us to the wild. Sarah McKenna never imagined that saving a wounded wolf in a notorious Bandit pass would lead her face to face with a Modoc warrior whose piercing gaze held secrets older than the mountains themselves. When he spoke those fateful words, "That was my father's," her world shifted forever. This is the extraordinary true story of how a simple act of compassion sparked an incredible journey across cultural divides, revealing that sometimes the most dangerous paths lead to the most profound discoveries about who we really are and what we're truly capable of becoming. What started as a routine supply run through treacherous territory became a life-altering adventure that would test every fiber of Sarah's courage, challenge her deepest prejudices, and ultimately prove that the bonds between human and animal, stranger and protector, can transcend even the most bitter historical wounds. Sarah McKenna gripped the leather reins tighter as her wagon wheels crunched over the rocky path that wound through Devil's Canyon. The notorious Bandit Pass lived up to its fearsome reputation, with jagged cliff faces that seemed to lean inward, creating an oppressive tunnel of stone that blocked out most of the afternoon's sun. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she guided her two horses, Belle and Thunder, through the treacherous route that connected her remote homestead to the trading post in Klamath Falls. The year was 1887, and the Oregon Territory still held pockets of untamed wilderness where civilization's rules bent like grass in a strong wind. Sarah had made this journey dozens of times over the past 3 years since her husband's death, but she never grew comfortable with the eerie silence that seemed to swallow even the horses' hoofbeats. The canyon walls rose nearly 200 feet on either side, creating natural corridors that bandits had used for decades to ambush unsuspecting travelers. Her wagon carried precious cargo this time: medical supplies for the town doctor, bolts of fabric for the general store, and a small pouch of gold dust that represented 6 months of careful saving. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. At 28 years old, Sarah had learned to navigate this dangerous world alone. Her auburn hair always tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and her late husband's Colt revolver never far from reach. As the wagon rounded a sharp bend, Belle suddenly reared up with a frightened whinny that echoed off the canyon walls like a gunshot. Thunder followed suit, backing away from something ahead on the narrow trail. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she struggled to control the panicking animals, certain that bandits had finally caught up with her. She reached for her revolver with one hand while trying to calm the horses with the other. But instead of masked outlaws, she saw something that made her freeze completely. There, sprawled across the rocky path like a fallen guardian, lay an enormous wolf. Even from 30 feet away, Sarah could see that this was no ordinary animal. The creature was massive, easily weighing over 100 pounds, with thick silver-gray fur that caught the filtered sunlight streaming through the canyon opening above. Dark patches of what looked suspiciously like dried blood matted the fur around its left shoulder and hind leg. Sarah's first instinct was to turn the wagon around immediately. Wolves in this region were known to be fierce and unpredictable, especially when wounded. The local ranchers had been complaining for months about livestock attacks, and bounty hunters regularly brought wolf pelts to town for the $5 reward. Yet something about this particular animal made her pause. The wolf wasn't moving. Its massive chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths that suggested serious injury or exhaustion. More concerning, she could see a crude snare wrapped around its right rear paw, the metal wire cutting deep into the flesh. Someone had deliberately trapped this magnificent creature, and from the looks of the surrounding area, it had been struggling to break free for quite some time. Sarah climbed down from her wagon seat slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Her practical woolen dress caught on the rough wooden edge of the wagon, but she barely noticed. Every fiber of her being screamed warnings about approaching a wild predator, yet she found herself walking steadily toward the injured animal. As she drew closer, she could see more details that made her heart ache with unexpected sympathy. This wolf was clearly ancient by animal standards, with graying fur around its muzzle and scars across its face that spoke of countless battles for survival. But its eyes, those amber eyes that turned to track her movement, held an intelligence that seemed almost human. There was no aggression in that gaze, only exhaustion, and what she could have sworn was resignation. "Easy there, old fellow," Sarah whispered, crouching down about 10 feet away from the trapped animal. "You're in a real fix, aren't you?" The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, but it made no attempt to snap or growl. Instead, those remarkable amber eyes seemed to study her with an intensity that made Sarah feel as if she were being evaluated by some ancient judge. She had grown up on a farm in Missouri before moving west with her husband, and she had always possessed an unusual connection with animals. Even as a child, she could calm spooked horses and coax injured birds back to health with patience and gentle persistence. But this situation was entirely different. Wolves were apex predators, capable of crushing bones with their powerful jaws. One wrong move could result in severe injury or death, and she was completely alone in a canyon where her screams would echo uselessly against stone walls. Yet something deeper than logic was driving her forward, a compelling sense that this moment had been ordained by forces beyond her understanding. Sarah reached into a wagon and retrieved a leather water pouch, along with some strips of dried beef she had packed for the journey. The wolf watched her every movement but remained perfectly still, as if understanding that she meant no harm. When she approached again, she noticed something that made her gasp with surprise. Hanging from a cord around the wolf's thick neck was an ornate silver medallion, unlike anything she had ever seen. The circular piece was roughly the size of a silver dollar, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to dance and shift in the dappled sunlight. Even from several feet away, she could see that this was no crude frontier craftsmanship. The medallion had been created by skilled hands using techniques that spoke of ancient traditions and profound cultural significance. "Someone owns you," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to the animal. Or rather, someone cared enough about you to give you something precious. The implications of this discovery sent her mind racing. This was clearly not just any wolf, but an animal with deep significance to someone. Most likely someone from one of the local Native American tribes. The Modoc people had lived in this region for thousands of years before white settlers arrived, and despite the conflicts and forced relocations of recent decades, many tribal members still maintain strong connections to the traditional ways of life that honored the sacred relationship between humans and animals. Sarah had heard stories from older settlers about tribal members who formed mystical bonds with wolves, treating them as family members or spiritual guides rather than mere animals. She had always dismissed such tales as frontier folklore, but seeing this magnificent creature wearing what was obviously a ceremonial medallion forced her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about the relationship between civilization and the wild. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink lower in the canyon, casting longer shadows that reminded Sarah of the practical dangers of her situation. Spending the night in Devil's Canyon was tantamount to suicide, with or without an injured wolf blocking her path. She needed to make a decision quickly, either attempt to help the animal or find a way around it and continue her journey. But as she looked into those amber eyes again, Sarah realized that choice had already been made. Some invisible force had led her to this moment, and walking away felt like betraying not just the wolf, but some essential part of her own humanity. She had lost so much over the past few years, her husband to a logging accident, her sense of security, her faith in the future, that the opportunity to preserve something beautiful and wild felt like a chance at redemption. Moving very slowly, Sarah approached the snare that held the wolf captive. The metal wire had been expertly crafted, designed to tighten as the animal struggled but never loosen enough to allow escape. Worse, the prolonged thrashing had caused the wire to cut deep into the flesh, creating wounds that would likely become infected if not treated soon. "I'm going to try to help you," Sarah said softly, kneeling beside the wolf's hindquarters. "But you have to trust me, and I have to trust you not to take my hand off." The wolf turned its massive head to watch her closely, but made no aggressive moves as Sarah examined the snare mechanism. The trap was more sophisticated than anything she had expected to find in this remote wilderness, suggesting that whoever had set it possessed considerable knowledge of wolf behavior and trapping techniques. More disturbing, the placement seemed deliberately positioned along a game trail, indicating that this had been a planned capture rather than random hunting. Using a small knife from her supply kit, Sarah began the delicate process of cutting through the metal wire without causing additional injury to the wolf's leg. The animal remained remarkably still throughout the procedure, occasionally lifting its head to watch her progress, but never showing signs of fear or aggression. It was as if some unspoken communication had passed between them, establishing trust despite the fact that they belonged to two different species that were traditionally enemies. As the final strand of wire parted, the wolf's leg came free with a soft grunt of relief from the animal. Sarah quickly tore strips from her cotton undergarment to create makeshift bandages, working with the efficiency of someone who had treated countless farm animal injuries over the years. The wounds were deep but clean, with no signs of bone damage that would prevent the wolf from eventually walking again. "There you go," Sarah said, sitting back on her heels to admire her handiwork. That should hold until you can find someone who knows more about wolf medicine than a frontier widow. The wolf struggled to its feet, favoring the injured leg, but clearly capable of movement. For a moment, animal and woman studied each other in the growing twilight, separated by only a few feet of rocky ground, but bridged by an experience that had somehow changed them both. Then, with a dignity that seemed almost regal, the wolf limped toward the canyon wall and disappeared into a crevice that Sarah hadn't even noticed before. She was alone again in Devil's Canyon, but the silence felt different now, less threatening and more expectant, as if the very stones were waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah gathered her medical supplies and returned to her wagon, where Bell and Thunder had calmed down enough to continue the journey. As she guided the horses forward through the spot where the wolf had lain, she noticed dark stains on the rocks that would serve as permanent reminders of this extraordinary encounter. The rest of the trip through Devil's Canyon passed without incident, but Sarah found herself constantly looking back over her shoulder, half expecting to see amber eyes watching her from the shadows. By the time she reached the relative safety of the main road leading to Klamath Falls, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and she realized that her life had fundamentally changed in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. That night, as she made camp beside a small stream just outside town, Sarah found herself thinking, not about the successful completion of her dangerous journey, but about the mysterious medallion around the wolf's neck, and the profound intelligence she had seen in those ancient amber eyes. Somewhere in the darkness beyond her campfire, she sensed that forces were already in motion that would soon bring her face to face with answers she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. 3 days after her encounter with the wolf, Sarah was hanging laundry behind her modest log cabin when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze. Living alone 20 miles from the nearest neighbor had taught her to be cautious about unexpected visitors, especially ones who approached without calling out a greeting. She quickly moved toward the kitchen door, where her husband's rifle leaned against the wall, her fingers closing around the familiar wooden stock as she peered through the window. What she saw made her question whether the isolation was finally affecting her mind. A lone rider was approaching her homestead, but this was unlike any visitor she had ever received. The man sat astride a magnificent painted horse with perfect posture, his long black hair flowing freely in the morning breeze. Even from a distance, she could see that his clothing was a mixture of traditional Native American garments and practical frontier wear, buckskin leggings, a blue cotton shirt, and what appeared to be an ornate vest decorated with intricate beadwork. Sarah's heart began racing as memories of her childhood in Missouri came flooding back. Her father had filled her young mind with terrifying stories about Indian raids and frontier massacres, tales that most settlers carried like invisible scars long after they had moved west. Despite her rational mind telling her that such conflicts were largely things of the past in this area, the deep-seated fears planted by those stories were difficult to overcome. The rider approached with deliberate slowness, his hands clearly visible and empty of weapons. When he was still 50 yards away, he called out in accented but perfectly clear English, "I mean no harm to you or your property. I come seeking information about something that belongs to my people." His voice carried easily across the open meadow that surrounded Sarah's cabin, and she was struck by the musical quality of his words, so different from the harsh frontier dialects she was accustomed to hearing. Despite her nervousness, something in his tone suggested sincerity rather than threat. She stepped onto a covered porch, keeping the rifle visible, but pointed toward the ground in a gesture that she hoped conveyed cautious readiness rather than outright hostility. The rider dismounted when he reached the edge of her property, leading his horse the final 30 feet on foot as a sign of respect and peaceful intentions. Up close, Sarah could see that he was probably in his early 30s, with strong features and dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of ancient wisdom. The beadwork on his vest was even more spectacular than she had initially realized. Tiny glass beads in blues, whites, and silvers had been arranged in patterns that seemed to tell a story she couldn't read. "I am Joseph Crowfeather of the Modoc people," he said, stopping a respectful distance from the porch steps. 3 days ago, someone in this area showed kindness to a wolf that carries great significance to my family. I have come to learn more about this person and to express the gratitude of my people. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of his words sank in. Somehow, this man knew about her encounter with the injured wolf in Devil's Canyon. But how could he possibly have learned about something that had happened in such a remote location, with no witnesses except the stones themselves? Her grip on the rifle tightened unconsciously as she tried to process this impossible situation. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said carefully, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they sounded unconvincing. I haven't seen any wolves around here. Joseph Crowfeather's expression remained patient and understanding, as if he had expected this initial denial. From a leather pouch at his side, he withdrew something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was a piece of cotton fabric, a strip that she immediately recognized as coming from her own undergarment, still stained with dried blood from the wolf's wounds. "The wolf you helped is sacred to my family," Joseph said gently. "His name is Silver Shadow, and he has been the guardian spirit of the Crowfeather clan for longer than most white settlers have been in this territory. When he did not return from his wandering 3 days ago, my grandfather sent me to search for him. I found him near the sacred caves where our ancestors are buried, healing from wounds that had been carefully tended by gentle hands." Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to understand how any of this was possible. The wolf she had helped was not just any wild animal, but apparently a creature of profound spiritual significance to this man's family. Moreover, Joseph had somehow tracked her down through methods that seemed to defy rational explanation. The piece of fabric he held was undeniable proof of her involvement, but she had been so careful to leave no trace of her presence in the canyon. "Silver Shadow wore this when he returned to us," Joseph continued, holding up the blood-stained cotton. "It carries your scent, which allowed our tracking dogs to follow the trail back to your homestead. But more than that, it carries something else. The essence of a kind heart that acted without thought of reward or recognition." The spiritual implications of what Joseph was saying were almost too overwhelming to process. Sarah had grown up in a devoutly Christian household where such beliefs were dismissed as pagan superstition, yet she could not deny the evidence of her own eyes. This man had somehow known about her most private act of compassion, and his knowledge seemed to extend far beyond what ordinary tracking methods could reveal. "Why is this wolf so important to your people?" Sarah asked, finally setting the rifle aside and stepping down from the porch. Something about Joseph's presence made her feel safe despite her cultural conditioning to fear Native Americans. His manner was respectful and dignified, completely at odds with the savage stereotypes that frontier newspapers loved to perpetuate. Joseph's eyes seemed to brighten with approval at her question, as if her willingness to listen had passed some kind of test. "Silver Shadow is not merely a wolf," he explained. "He is the last of a bloodline that has served as guardian to the Crowfeather family for 7 generations. My great-great-grandfather formed a bond with Silver Shadow's ancestor during the time of the Great Winter, when our people nearly starved and the wolves shared their hunting grounds with us." The story that Joseph began to tell transported Sarah to a different world, one where the boundaries between human and animal, physical and spiritual, were far more fluid than anything she had ever imagined. According to Modoc tradition, certain wolves were chosen by the spirits to serve as protectors and guides for specific families. These animals possessed unusual intelligence and longevity, often living for decades longer than ordinary wolves, while maintaining an almost mystical connection to their human companions. "Silver Shadow's grandfather saved my great-grandfather's life during a blizzard that lasted for 15 days, Joseph continued. "Ever since then, the wolves of this bloodline have been considered full members of our family. They are not pets or trained animals, but partners who choose to share their lives with us out of mutual respect and affection." Sarah found herself drawn into the narrative despite her skepticism about such mystical claims. There had definitely been something extraordinary about the wolf she had encountered, an intelligence and dignity that seemed to transcend ordinary animal behavior. The ornate medallion around its neck now made perfect sense as a symbol of its special status within Joseph's family and culture. "But how did you know it was me who helped him?" Sarah asked. "Even if you could track my scent somehow. Devil's Canyon is 20 miles from here. How could you be certain that I was the person you were looking for?" Joseph smiled for the first time since his arrival, and the expression transformed his entire face from stoic dignity to warm humanity. "Silver Shadow showed us," he said simply. "When our medicine woman examined his wounds, she saw images in her dreams. Visions of a woman with hair the color of autumn leaves, wearing a blue dress and speaking words of comfort while she worked to free him from the trap." The matter-of-fact way Joseph described this supernatural revelation made Sarah feel as if her rational worldview was crumbling, like a house built on sand. Yet she could not deny that his description was accurate down to the smallest details, including the blue dress she had been wearing and the auburn color of her hair that had escaped from beneath her hat during the rescue effort. "Your people have abilities that my kind doesn't understand," Sarah said slowly, trying to process the implications of what she was hearing. "How is it possible for someone to see visions of events they never witnessed? The connection between all living things runs deeper than most white people realize." Joseph replied, Silver Shadow and our medicine woman have shared thoughts and dreams for many years. When he was injured and frightened, his mind reached out for comfort, and she was able to see through his eyes the kindness of the woman who helped him. As if summoned by their conversation about mystical connections, a familiar figure emerged from the tree line at the edge of Sarah's property. Silver Shadow himself appeared among the pine trees, moving with only a slight limp to show for his recent ordeal. The great wolf's silver-gray fur gleamed in the morning sunlight as he approached with dignified confidence, showing no fear of either human despite his recent traumatic experience with traps. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched the magnificent animal walk directly toward them. In the 3 days since their encounter, she had convinced herself that the wolf's unusual behavior had been due to injury and exhaustion. Seeing him now, clearly healthy and moving with purpose, forced her to acknowledge that there truly was something extraordinary about this creature. Silver Shadow approached Joseph first, pressing his massive head against the man's chest in a gesture of obvious affection. Joseph's hands moved through the wolf's thick fur with the familiarity of a lifetime partnership, checking the bandaged leg and examining the healing wounds with gentle expertise. The bond between them was so obvious and profound that Sarah felt like an intruder witnessing an intimate family reunion. Then, to her complete amazement, Silver Shadow turned toward her and approached with the same confident stride he had shown with Joseph. The wolf stopped directly in front of her and sat down, those remarkable amber eyes looking up into her face with an expression that she could only describe as gratitude. Without thinking, Sarah reached out to touch the wolf's head, and Silver Shadow leaned into her touch with obvious pleasure. "He remembers your kindness," Joseph said softly, "and he wants you to know that your compassion has created a bond that will last far beyond this single encounter." The weight of Silver Shadow's massive head against her palm sent strange tingles through Sarah's arm, as if some invisible energy was passing between them. She had touched hundreds of animals over the course of her life, but this contact felt fundamentally different, more like communication than simple physical interaction. For just a moment, she could have sworn she sensed the wolf's thoughts, feeling echoes of gratitude, respect, and something that might have been protective affection. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, reluctantly pulling her hand away from Silver Shadow's warm fur. "I helped him because it seemed like the right thing to do, not because I expected anything in return." Joseph's expression became serious as he considered her question. "Among my people, acts of kindness towards sacred animals create obligations and opportunities," he said. "Silver Shadow has accepted you as a friend, which means you are now under the protection of the Crow Feather clan. But it also means that your life has become connected to ours in ways that may bring both blessings and challenges." The ominous undertone in Joseph's voice made Sarah's stomach flutter with nervous anticipation. She sensed that her simple act of mercy in Devil's Canyon had set in motion forces that would fundamentally change the direction of her life, but she had no way of knowing whether those changes would prove beneficial or dangerous. "What kind of challenges?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "There are those among both our peoples who view the old bonds between humans and wolves as threats to their vision of how the world should be," Joseph replied carefully. "Some white settlers see all wolves as enemies to be eliminated, while some of my own people believe that maintaining connections with white settlers will weaken our traditional ways. Your kindness to Silver Shadow has made you visible to forces that prefer to operate in shadows." As if to emphasize the truth of Joseph's warning, the sound of distant gunshots echoed across the valley from the direction of the main road. Both humans turned toward the sound, and Sarah saw Joseph's hand move instinctively toward the knife at his belt. Silver Shadow rose to his feet and moved protectively between Sarah and the direction of the shots, his body language shifting from relaxed friendliness to alert guardianship. "Trouble comes sooner than I had hoped," Joseph said grimly. "There are men in this territory who have been hunting Silver Shadow for weeks, not for the bounty on wolf pelts, but because they know his true significance to my people. Your rescue of him may have saved his life temporarily, but it has also revealed his location to those who wish him harm." Sarah's peaceful morning had transformed into something that felt like the opening chapter of an adventure novel, complete with mystical connections, ancient traditions, and approaching danger. As she looked into Silver Shadow's amber eyes and saw her own reflection gazing back, she realized that her quiet life as an isolated frontier widow was about to become something entirely unexpected. The gunshots grew closer, and Sarah counted at least 6 distinct rifle reports echoing through the pine-covered valley. Joseph's face had taken on a grim expression that spoke of experience with this type of situation. while Silver Shadow's entire body had gone rigid with alert tension. The wolf's ears were pricked forward, rotating slightly as he tracked sounds that human ears couldn't yet distinguish. "How many men?" Sarah asked, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded despite the fear that was making her heart race. "At least 4 riders, probably more," Joseph replied, his hand now resting openly on his knife handle. "They are not hunting deer or rabbits with those weapons. The shots are too deliberate, too organized. They are signaling to each other as they spread out to surround something." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air as the implications became clear. "They're surrounding us, aren't they?" Joseph nodded grimly. "Silver Shadow's presence here has drawn them like wolves to a wounded deer. These are not random bounty hunters or casual Indian fighters. Someone with knowledge of our traditions has told them about the sacred wolves and their importance to my people." As if to confirm his words, 3 more gunshots rang out from different directions, creating a rough triangle of sound around Sarah's homestead. The methodical nature of the approach suggested military training, or at least extensive experience with coordinated attacks. Whoever these men were, they knew exactly what they were doing. "We have maybe 10 minutes before they reach the cabin," Joseph said, moving towards his horse with swift efficiency. "Silver Shadow needs to reach the sacred caves where my people can protect him, but the route will take him directly through their line of approach." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to understand why complete strangers would go to such lengths to capture or kill one wolf, no matter how spiritually significant he might be to the local Native American population. Why is Silver Shadow so important that men would risk their lives hunting him? Surely there are easier ways to harass your people. Joseph paused in checking his horse's saddle, his expression becoming even more troubled. "You do not understand the larger forces at work here," he said. "There are men in the territorial government who believe that breaking our connection to the old ways will make it easier to force the remaining Modoc people onto reservations. They see Silver Shadow and the other sacred animals as symbols that keep our traditional beliefs alive." The explanation hit Sarah like a physical blow as she realized the scope of what she had stumbled into. This was not just about one woman helping an injured animal, but about cultural survival and the systematic attempt to destroy Native American traditions. Her act of kindness had inadvertently placed her at the center of a conflict that had been building for decades. But surely the territorial authorities wouldn't sanction open violence against civilians, Sarah protested. Though even as she spoke, she remembered stories of unofficial militias and bounty hunters who operated with tacit government approval. "The men approaching us do not wear uniforms or carry official orders," Joseph replied. "But they are funded by interests that profit from Indian removal and land speculation. Dead wolves cannot serve as spiritual guardians, and displaced tribes cannot claim traditional hunting grounds." Silver Shadow suddenly lifted his massive head and released a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. The wolf was staring intently toward the tree line on the eastern side of the property, his amber eyes fixed on something that neither human could yet see. But his body language made it clear that immediate danger was approaching from that direction. "They are closer than I thought," Joseph said, swinging up onto his horse with fluid grace. "Silver Shadow, we must run now if we are to reach the sacred places safely."
Sarah watched in amazement as the wolf seemed to understand every word Joseph had spoken.
Silver Shadow moved toward the mounted warrior with obvious intelligence, positioning himself beside the horse as if preparing for a coordinated retreat. The partnership between man and animal was so seamless that it seemed almost telepathic. "What about me?" Sarah asked, suddenly realizing that she might be left alone to face whatever was coming through the trees. "If these men know I helped Silver Shadow, won't they consider me a threat as well?" Joseph's expression softened with what looked like genuine regret. "You are not safe here anymore," he admitted. "Your kindness to Silver Shadow has marked you as an ally of my people, which makes you an enemy to those who seek our destruction. But I cannot ask you to abandon your home and possessions to flee with us into the wilderness." The sound of breaking branches and approaching hoofbeats was growing louder, eliminating time for lengthy deliberation. Sarah looked around her homestead, the cabin her husband had built with his own hands, the vegetable garden she had cultivated for 3 years, the carefully accumulated possessions that represented her entire life savings. Everything she had worked for since becoming a widow was here, on this 20-acre plot of land. But as she stood there weighing her options, Sarah realized that her choice had already been made. The moment she had knelt down beside an injured wolf in Devil's Canyon, she had crossed an invisible line that separated her old life from something entirely new. The approaching gunmen represented forces that would not hesitate to destroy anyone who got in their way, and staying behind would likely mean death or worse. "I'm coming with you," Sarah said firmly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Just give me 2 minutes to grab some supplies." Joseph's eyes widened with what might have been admiration or concern. "The journey will be dangerous," he warned. "We will be traveling through country where few white women have ever set foot, and we may be pursued for days or weeks." "I've been taking care of myself in dangerous country for 3 years," Sarah replied, already moving toward the cabin door, "and I have a feeling that staying here would be far more dangerous than anything we might encounter out there." She rushed into a small home and quickly gathered the most essential items she could carry: her husband's revolver and ammunition, a knife, medical supplies, a change of clothes, and the small pouch of gold dust that represented her emergency savings. As an afterthought, she grabbed a leather-bound journal that contained pressed flowers and written memories from her married life. If she was about to lose everything else, she wanted to preserve at least some connection to the woman she had been before this morning. Outside, the sounds of approaching riders were becoming impossible to ignore. The wolf's behavior made it clear that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. "There is one more thing you must understand before we leave," Joseph said, as Sarah emerged from the cabin with her hastily packed supplies. "The bond between you and Silver Shadow goes beyond simple gratitude. Among my people, anyone who saves the life of a sacred wolf becomes what we call a spirit-touched person. This brings certain abilities, but also certain responsibilities." Sarah felt a strange tingling sensation in her hands as Joseph spoke, almost like the feeling she had experienced when touching Silver Shadow's fur. "What kind of abilities?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. "You will find that your connection to animals becomes stronger," Joseph explained. "You may begin to sense their thoughts and emotions, and they may respond to you in ways that seem impossible to others. But this gift also makes you valuable to those who would use such abilities for their own purposes." Before Sarah could ask what that meant, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed from the tree line, followed immediately by a bullet that splintered the wooden post supporting her porch roof. The attack had begun, eliminating any remaining time for explanation or preparation. "Ride behind me," Joseph commanded, extending his hand to help Sarah mount his horse. "Silver Shadow will guide us to safety, but we must trust his instincts completely." Sarah had ridden horses all her life, but never in a situation like this. As Joseph's powerful arms closed around her waist, and his horse leaped forward into a gallop, she felt as if she were being swept away by forces as unstoppable as a spring flood. Behind them, more gunshots erupted from multiple directions, confirming that they had escaped the trap by mere minutes. Silver Shadow ran alongside the horse with surprising speed despite his recently injured leg, his powerful stride eating up ground as he led them toward a gap in the tree line that Sarah would never have noticed on her own. The wolf seemed to know exactly where he was going, following invisible trails through dense forest that grew thicker and more impenetrable with each passing mile. As they rode deeper into wilderness that few white settlers had ever seen, Sarah caught glimpses of their pursuers through breaks in the foliage. At least 6 riders were following their trail, spread out in a formation that suggested military training and serious intent. These were not casual bounty hunters or opportunistic bandits, but men who had been specifically recruited and equipped for this particular mission. "Who are they?" Sarah called over the thundering of hoofbeats and the rushing of wind through pine branches. "Men who serve interests larger than themselves," Joseph replied grimly. "Some are former soldiers who fought in the Indian Wars. Others are hired guns who work for land speculators and mining companies. All of them have been told that eliminating sacred animals like Silver Shadow is necessary for the advancement of civilization." The chase continued for more than 2 hours as they moved deeper into mountainous terrain that grew increasingly rugged and difficult to navigate. Silver Shadow led them along game trails that wound between massive boulders and through narrow valleys carved by ancient streams. Several times, Sarah was certain they would be trapped against impassable cliff faces, only to discover hidden passages that the wolf seemed to know by instinct. During a brief rest beside a mountain stream, Joseph explained more about the forces that had driven them from Sarah's homestead. "There is a man named Colonel Marcus Whitfield who believes that Native American spiritual practices pose a threat to territorial expansion," he said. "He has convinced investors and politicians that tribes will never fully assimilate as long as they maintain connections to sacred animals and traditional beliefs." Sarah absorbed this information while Silver Shadow drank from the stream, his amber eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest for signs of pursuit. The wolf's behavior remained alert but not panicked, suggesting that their immediate danger had diminished but not disappeared. "So this Colonel Whitfield wants to kill all the sacred animals as a way of breaking tribal resistance to relocation?" Sarah asked, trying to understand the strategic thinking behind such a plan. "Not just kill them," Joseph corrected. "Capture them when possible, to be displayed as trophies that demonstrate the powerlessness of traditional ways. Dead martyrs can inspire resistance, but caged spirits show only defeat." The implications of this revelation made Sarah's stomach turn with disgust. She had heard of men who collected exotic animals as symbols of their dominance over nature, but the deliberate targeting of creatures with profound spiritual significance seemed particularly cruel and calculating. "How many other families have been affected by these attacks?" she asked. Joseph's expression became even more troubled. "Silver Shadow is the last of his bloodline," he admitted. 3 other sacred wolves have been captured or killed over the past year, along with several eagles, bears, and other animals that serve as spiritual guardians for different clans. The traditional connections between my people and the natural world are being systematically severed. As they resumed their flight deeper into the wilderness, Sarah found herself thinking not just about her own safety, but about the larger cultural tragedy that was unfolding around them. Her simple act of compassion had revealed a conflict between worldviews so fundamental that compromise seemed impossible. On one side stood those who saw nature as a collection of resources to be exploited for human benefit. On the other stood those who believed in sacred relationships between humans and animals that transcended mere ownership or utility. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks, when Silver Shadow finally led them to what appeared to be their destination. Hidden in a narrow canyon that could only be reached through a series of switchbacking paths known only to the wolf, a small collection of traditional Modoc dwellings came into view. Smoke rose from carefully tended fires, and Sarah could see people moving about with the quiet efficiency of a community that had learned to live in harmony with its surroundings. But even in this remote sanctuary, the signs of ongoing conflict were unmistakable. Armed warriors maintained watch positions on the surrounding cliffs, and Sarah could see that preparations had been made for extended siege conditions. The sacred caves that Joseph had mentioned were obviously more than just spiritual sites. They had become the last refuge for people fighting to preserve a way of life that the outside world was determined to destroy. The hidden canyon that sheltered the remaining members of the Crowfeather clan was unlike anything Sarah had ever imagined. Ancient red sandstone walls rose hundreds of feet on all sides, creating a natural fortress that could only be accessed through narrow passages that Silver Shadow had navigated with the confidence of long familiarity. Springs emerged from the rock face at multiple points, creating a series of crystal-clear pools that supported lush vegetation despite the arid climate of the surrounding mountains. As Joseph's horse descended the final switchback into the canyon floor, Sarah felt as if she were entering a world that existed outside of normal time. The dwellings scattered throughout the valley were not the primitive teepees or ramshackle structures that frontier newspapers typically associated with Native American communities. Instead, she saw carefully constructed homes that combined traditional materials with innovative adaptations to the unique environment of the sacred caves. Some families lived in cliff dwellings carved directly into the sandstone walls, their windows and doorways framed with intricate stonework that spoke of generations of accumulated skill. Others had built elegant structures using wood, stone, and hide that seemed to grow organically from the canyon floor like natural formations. Gardens flourished in protected alcoves where the microclimate created by the springs supported crops that would have been impossible to grow in the harsh conditions outside the canyon. But what struck Sarah most powerfully was the sense of community that permeated everything she observed. Children played games that incorporated lessons about wildlife behavior and plant identification. Adults worked together on tasks that required multiple skills, sharing knowledge and responsibilities with an efficiency that spoke of deep cultural traditions. Elders sat in shaded areas where they could observe and guide younger generations while sharing stories that preserved thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. "Welcome to the last free village of the Modoc people," Joseph said softly as they approached a group of adults who had emerged from their dwellings to greet the new arrivals. "Here we maintain the old ways while preparing for whatever the future may bring." Silver Shadow bounded ahead to receive affectionate greetings from people who were clearly overjoyed to see him safely returned. Sarah watched in amazement as the great wolf moved from person to person, accepting embraces and gentle touches, while communicating through body language that seemed as complex as spoken words. Children who could not have been more than 5 or 6 years old showed no fear as they buried their small hands in his thick fur, and he responded to their attention with obvious pleasure. An elderly woman approached Joseph's horse, her weathered face breaking into a smile of relief as she saw that her grandson had returned safely. She was dressed in traditional clothing that had been decorated with the same intricate beadwork Sarah had admired on Joseph's vest, but her garment showed evidence of adaptation to the practical demands of life in the hidden canyon. A curved knife hung at her side, and her hands showed the calluses of someone who worked regularly with tools and weapons. "Grandmother, this is Sarah McKenna," Joseph said, dismounting and helping Sarah down from the horse. "She is the woman Silver Shadow showed us in the vision dreams. She freed him from the white man's trap and tended his wounds with her own hands." The elderly woman studied Sarah with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to look directly into her soul. After a moment that felt like an eternity, her stern expression softened into something approaching approval. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected the entire community. "I am Winter Moon, medicine woman of the Crowfeather clan, and keeper of the sacred wolf traditions," she said in English that was heavily accented but perfectly clear. "Silver Shadow has told me much about you through our shared dreams. You carry the mark of one whose spirit has been touched by the old powers." Sarah felt that strange tingling sensation in her hands again as Wintermoon spoke, stronger now than it had been during her previous encounters with Silver Shadow and Joseph. She looked down at her palms and was startled to see faint lines of silver light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. The phenomenon lasted only a few seconds, but it was clearly visible enough that both Joseph and his grandmother noticed it as well. "The spirit touch grows stronger when you are near the sacred places," Wintermoon explained, seeming unsurprised by what they had all witnessed. "This is both a blessing and a burden, child. The abilities you are developing will allow you to communicate with animals in ways that few humans ever experience, but they will also make you a target for those who fear such powers." Before Sarah could ask what that meant, a commotion erupted near the canyon entrance. One of the warriors posted as lookouts came running toward them with news that made everyone's faces turn grim with worry. Even without understanding the rapid Modoc words he spoke, Sarah could tell that the situation was serious based on the reactions of the people around her. "Our pursuers have found the outer trails," Joseph translated for Sarah's benefit. "They have not yet discovered the hidden passages, but they are systematically searching every canyon and valley in this area. It is only a matter of time before they locate us." Wintermoon issued a series of rapid commands that sent people scattering throughout the village with obvious urgency. Sarah watched as the entire community transformed from peaceful domestic routine to efficient preparation for siege conditions. Weapons were distributed, supplies were moved to protected locations, and children were gathered into groups that could be quickly evacuated if necessary. "How long can you hold out if they find this place?" Sarah asked, though she was already dreading the answer. "The sacred caves have natural defenses that make them nearly impregnable to direct assault," Wintermoon replied. "But we cannot survive indefinitely under siege conditions. Our food supplies are limited, and we have elderly people and small children who cannot endure prolonged hardship." Sarah felt a crushing weight of responsibility as she realized that her decision to help Silver Shadow had led these people into mortal danger. If she had simply driven her wagon around the injured wolf and continued on her way, the pursuers would never have tracked him to the sanctuary. Her good intentions had potentially doomed an entire community of people who had already suffered generations of persecution and displacement.
"This is my fault,"
she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should never have gotten involved. Now all of you are at risk because of my actions." Wintermoon placed a weathered hand on Sarah's shoulder, and the touch sent another wave of that strange energy through her body. "You speak from guilt, but you do not understand the larger patterns that govern such events," the medicine woman said gently. "Silver Shadow was meant to encounter you in that canyon. The spirits orchestrated that meeting for reasons that reach far beyond this immediate crisis." The explanation did little to ease Sarah's conscience, but she could see that Wintermoon spoke with the conviction of someone whose beliefs had been tested by decades of experience. Around them, the preparations for defense continued, with grim efficiency that suggested this community had faced similar threats before and survived through careful planning and mutual cooperation. Joseph approached, carrying weapons that he offered to Sarah with obvious reluctance. "Can you use these?" he asked, indicating a rifle and ammunition that appeared to be of recent military manufacture. Sarah examined the weapon and found it to be similar to firearms she had learned to use during her years as a frontier wife. "Well enough," she admitted. "But I've never shot at people before, only wild animals and targets." "Pray to whatever powers you believe in that you will not have to shoot at people today either," Joseph replied. But if our enemies breach the canyon defenses, the choice may be taken from all of us. As afternoon shadows lengthened into evening, the hidden village continued its transformation into a fortress. Sarah found herself assigned to help prepare medical supplies under Wintermoon's supervision, learning about traditional healing techniques that incorporated plants and minerals found throughout the canyon environment. The work helped distract her from the growing anxiety about their situation, while also providing insights into a sophisticated medical knowledge that had been accumulated over countless generations. Your people know things about healing that my doctors back east never learned, Sarah observed as Wintermoon demonstrated how to prepare poultices from various plant materials. Different environments require different solutions, Wintermoon replied. But the basic principles remain the same. Work with the body's natural healing processes rather than fighting against them. This is true for communities as well as individuals. When outside forces threaten our survival, we adapt by drawing on inner strengths that outsiders cannot see or understand. As if summoned by their conversation about healing, Silver Shadow appeared beside them carrying something in his powerful jaws. Sarah was amazed to see that he had brought specific plants that Wintermoon had been describing, medicinal herbs that grew in remote parts of the canyon where the wolf could travel more easily than humans.
He has been gathering supplies for us all day, Wintermoon explained, accepting the plants with obvious gratitude.
Silver Shadow understands that we face a long struggle, and he contributes according to his abilities just like any other member of our community. Sarah watched the interaction between human and wolf with growing amazement. This was not the relationship between master and pet that she had observed in white settlements, but a genuine partnership between equals who respected each other's unique capabilities. Silver Shadow's intelligence was clearly far beyond anything she had previously imagined possible in an animal, and his dedication to the welfare of the human community was both touching and inspiring. As darkness fell over the canyon, the lookouts reported torchlight moving through the surrounding mountains as their pursuers continued their systematic search. The orange glow of multiple fires created an ominous constellation that seemed to be slowly tightening around the hidden sanctuary like a closing net. Even protected within the natural fortress of the sacred caves, Sarah could feel the psychological pressure of being surrounded by enemies whose intentions were entirely hostile. "They will not find us tonight," Wintermoon said with quiet confidence. "The entrance passages are too difficult to navigate in darkness, and Silver Shadow would sense their approach long before they could reach us. But tomorrow will bring greater challenges." Sarah settled into the sleeping area that had been prepared for her, grateful for the warm blankets and the sense of safety provided by the watchful community around her. But sleep eluded her as she lay listening to the sounds of the canyon night, the whisper of wind through stone passages, the distant call of owls, and the soft conversations of warriors maintaining their vigilant watch. Sometime after midnight, she was awakened by a gentle touch on her shoulder. Silver Shadow was standing beside her sleeping mat, his amber eyes glowing faintly in the starlight that filtered down through the canyon opening. Without making a sound, the great wolf indicated that she should follow him. And Sarah found herself rising and walking through the sleeping village, as if drawn by invisible threads. Silver Shadow led her to a narrow passage she had not noticed before, one that wound upward through the canyon wall toward what appeared to be a natural balcony overlooking the entire valley. As they climbed the ancient trail worn smooth by countless generations of feet and paws, Sarah felt that tingling sensation growing stronger with each step. At the top of the passage, she found herself standing on a platform carved from living rock that commanded a sweeping view of the surrounding mountains. But it was not the scenery that took her breath away. It was the realization that she could suddenly sense the presence and emotional state of every living creature within miles of their location. The pursuing men were camped in 3 different locations, their minds filled with a mixture of greed, fear, and grim determination that felt like dark clouds pressing against her consciousness. But she could also sense the wildlife of the mountains. Deer bedded down in protected valleys, bears denning in remote caves, birds roosting in the highest branches of ancient pines. The web of life that surrounded them was vast and complex, and for the first time in her life, Sarah could perceive her place within that larger pattern. "Now you begin to understand why certain animals are considered sacred," Wintermoon's voice said softly from behind her. Sarah turned to find the medicine woman ascending the trail, with the silent grace of someone half her age. "Silver Shadow brought you here so that you could experience the full awakening of your spirit-touched abilities." As Sarah stood on that ancient platform with Silver Shadow pressed against her side and Wintermoon's wise presence beside her, she realized that her life as a simple frontier widow was truly over. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, She was no longer the same woman who had freed an injured wolf from a trap just 4 days earlier. The spirits had marked her for a purpose. She was only beginning to understand, and there would be no returning to the safety of ignorance or isolation. Dawn came to the sacred canyon with an ominous stillness that made every member of the community tense with anticipation. Sarah had spent the remainder of the night on the observation platform with Winter Moon and Silver Shadow, learning to control and interpret the flood of sensory information that her newly awakened abilities provided. By sunrise, she could distinguish between the emotional signatures of individual animals and even sensed the general intentions of the pursuing men who had camped around the canyon's perimeter. "They are preparing for a coordinated assault," Sarah reported, her enhanced perceptions allowing her to read the psychological preparation taking place in the enemy camps. "The man leading them feels confident that they have trapped us. But he is also anxious about something, as if he fears that time is working against him rather than in his favor." Winter Moon nodded with grim satisfaction.
"Colonel Whitfield's men operate without official sanction," she explained. "The longer they spend in this territory hunting sacred animals, the greater the risk that their activities will be discovered by federal authorities who might not approve of such methods."
Joseph appeared at the top of the trail, his face bearing news that confirmed Sarah's intuitive assessment. "Our scouts report at least 20 men in position around the canyon," he said. "They have military equipment including several small cannons that could breach our defenses if properly positioned. But their leader seems reluctant to begin the assault, almost as if he is waiting for something." Sarah closed her eyes and extended her consciousness toward the enemy camps, using techniques that Winter Moon had taught her during their long night vigil. The ability to sense emotions and intentions at a distance was still new and overwhelming, but she was beginning to understand how to focus her attention on specific individuals rather than being flooded with information from every living creature in the area. "He is waiting for reinforcements," she said after several minutes of concentrated effort. "Someone with greater authority than his own. Someone whose presence will legitimize whatever violence they plan to commit here." The implications of this revelation sent a chill through all three companions. If Colonel Whitfield himself was coming to oversee the assault on the sacred canyon, it meant that the attack would be conducted with maximum ruthlessness and efficiency. More troubling, it suggested that powerful political interests were invested in the outcome of this particular conflict. "How long before these reinforcements arrive?" Joseph asked, his hand moving instinctively to check his weapons. Sarah concentrated again, reaching out with senses she was still learning to trust. "Hours, not days," she replied. "The man in charge of the camps is growing more anxious as time passes. Whatever timeline they are operating under, it is approaching its deadline." Winter Moon stood and began walking toward the trail that led back down to the village. "Then we must act before they can coordinate their full strength against us," she said with the calm decisiveness that had obviously guided her people through countless crises. "It is time to implement the final plan." As they descended toward the canyon floor, Joseph explained what Winter Moon meant by the final plan. For months, the Crowfeather clan had been secretly preparing an evacuation route that would allow them to escape to even more remote territory in the event that their current sanctuary was compromised. The route involved traveling through a network of underground passages that connected the sacred caves to other canyon systems dozens of miles away. "The passages were carved by our ancestors during the time of the Great Troubles 200 years ago," Joseph said. "They connect to ceremonial sites that have been hidden from white settlers since the first conflicts began. If we can reach those places, we will be beyond the reach of any pursuit." Sarah felt a moment of profound sadness as she realized what this meant for the beautiful community she had discovered in the hidden canyon. Everything that the Crowfeather clan had built here would have to be abandoned: homes, gardens, sacred sites, and irreplaceable cultural artifacts accumulated over generations. Their choice was between destruction and displacement, with no option that would allow them to preserve both their lives and their established way of life. But as the morning progressed and the evacuation preparations began in earnest, Sarah was struck by the resilience and adaptability that the community demonstrated in the face of this crisis. Rather than despairing over what they would lose, people focused on determining what could be saved and transported to their new refuge. Essential supplies were bundled efficiently, sacred objects were carefully protected for the journey, and practical decisions were made with the speed that comes from long experience with forced migrations. "Your people have done this before," Sarah observed to Winter Moon as she helped package medical supplies for transport. "Many times," Winter Moon confirmed. "Survival for our people has always required the ability to move when necessary while preserving the essential elements of our culture. Physical locations can be replaced, but knowledge, relationships, and spiritual connections are irreplaceable treasures that we carry with us wherever we go. Silver Shadow moved through the village like a general overseeing military preparations, his enhanced senses allowing him to detect the approach of danger long before human lookouts could spot movement in the surrounding mountains. Several times throughout the morning, he alerted the community to the presence of scouts attempting to find better vantage points for the coming assault, allowing defensive positions to be adjusted accordingly. But it was around midday that Silver Shadow's behavior changed in a way that made everyone stop what they were doing and pay attention. Instead of his usual alert but controlled watchfulness, the great wolf began showing signs of extreme agitation, pacing restlessly, whining softly, and staring toward the canyon entrance with an intensity that spoke of immediate danger. "They are coming now," Sarah said, her enhanced perceptions confirming what Silver Shadow's behavior suggested. "Not just the men who have been surrounding us, but the reinforcements as well. I can sense new minds approaching. Minds filled with cold purpose and complete confidence in their ability to destroy everything they encounter." Joseph ran toward the lookout positions while Winter Moon began issuing rapid commands that initiated the final evacuation sequence. But as Sarah extended her consciousness toward the approaching threat, she sensed something that made her blood run cold with fear and determination. "Wait," she called out, her voice carrying across the village with surprising authority. "There is something else." One of the approaching minds feels different from the others, familiar somehow, but twisted with hatred and obsession. Winter Moon turned to stare at Sarah with an expression of growing alarm. "Describe what you sense," the medicine woman commanded. Sarah closed her eyes and focused all her attention on the disturbing presence she had detected among the approaching enemies. "It feels like someone who has been touched by the same forces that awaken my abilities," she said slowly. "But instead of learning to work in harmony with animals, this person has been using those connections to hunt and destroy sacred creatures." The revelation that one of their enemies possessed abilities similar to Sarah's own changed everything about their tactical situation. If Colonel Whitfield had recruited someone with spirit-touched powers to hunt Silver Shadow and other sacred animals, it explained how they had been able to track their quarry so effectively and why their current sanctuary had been compromised. "Marcus Whitfield's son died in an attack by what he believed was a sacred wolf," Winter Moon said grimly. "But instead of accepting the loss as part of the natural cycle, he has spent years learning perverted versions of our traditional animal communication techniques. He uses his abilities to turn animals against each other and to hunt down creatures that others of his kind protect." The approaching danger suddenly took on personal dimensions that transcended the simple conflict between settlers and Native Americans. This was a confrontation between two fundamentally different approaches to the relationship between humans and the natural world. One based on respect and partnership, the other driven by domination and revenge. "The evacuation must proceed immediately," Joseph said, returning from the lookout posts with confirmation of what Sarah's senses had already revealed. "We have perhaps 30 minutes before they reach the outer defenses, and once the assault begins, the tunnel entrances will be impossible to reach safely." But as the community began moving toward the hidden passages that led to the underground escape route, Silver Shadow planted himself firmly in the center of the canyon and refused to move. The great wolf's amber eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made words unnecessary. He was communicating a message that she understood with perfect clarity. "He won't leave," Sarah announced, her voice carrying across the evacuation preparations and stopping everyone in their tracks. "Silver Shadow knows that the person hunting him will never stop as long as he remains alive. If he flees now, this same danger will simply follow to threaten whatever new sanctuary you establish." Winter Moon's weathered face reflected the terrible wisdom of someone who had guided her people through decades of impossible choices. "Silver Shadow is offering to sacrifice himself to ensure our survival," she said quietly. "But accepting that sacrifice would mean abandoning everything our clan has stood for since the first wolf chose to bond with the first crowfeather ancestor." Sarah felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her newly awakened abilities allowed her to sense the emotions and intentions of everyone around her, creating an overwhelming flood of fear, hope, determination, and despair from dozens of minds simultaneously. But cutting through all that chaos was one clear certainty. There had to be another way. "What if Silver Shadow doesn't have to sacrifice himself or flee?" Sarah asked, an idea beginning to form in her mind. "What if we could turn the situation to our advantage instead?" Over the next 20 minutes, as the sounds of approaching enemies grew louder in the surrounding mountains, Sarah outlined a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal, depending on one's perspective. Using her enhanced abilities to coordinate with Silver Shadow and other animals in the area, she proposed to create a diversion that would allow the community to evacuate while simultaneously eliminating the threat posed by Colonel Whitfield's Spirit-touched hunter, the plan requires you to place yourself in mortal danger, Joseph pointed out. If you miscalculate the timing, or if your abilities are not as developed as we hope, you could be killed or captured. And if we do nothing, everyone here will be killed or captured anyway, Sarah replied. At least this way, we have a chance to save the community and break the cycle of persecution that has been destroying sacred animals throughout the territory. Winter Moon studied Sarah's face for a long moment, and whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. The spirits brought you to us for a purpose, she said finally. If your heart tells you that this is the path you must take, then we will trust in the wisdom of forces greater than ourselves. As the final evacuation preparations reached their climax, Sarah found herself standing beside Silver Shadow at the center of the canyon while the sounds of coordinated assault grew closer. Her enhanced senses allowed her to track the movements of every enemy soldier, every allied defender, and every wild creature within miles of their location. For the first time since awakening these abilities, she felt confident in her power to influence the outcome of events through means that her enemies could not anticipate or counter. The plan she had conceived was complex and dangerous, requiring split-second timing and perfect coordination between multiple participants who had never worked together before. But as Sarah looked into Silver Shadow's amber eyes and felt the absolute trust and partnership flowing between them, she knew that some connections transcend the boundaries of species, language, and cultural tradition. When the first gunshots echoed through the sacred canyon, Sarah and Silver Shadow were ready. The final confrontation between old ways and new, between respect and exploitation, between the sacred and the profitable, was about to begin. And for the first time since this extraordinary adventure started with a simple act of mercy in Devil's Canyon, Sarah felt that the forces of compassion and wisdom might actually prevail against the forces of hatred and greed. The outcome would depend not just on courage and planning, but on the willingness of all participants to trust in connections that could not be measured or quantified, the invisible bonds that join all living creatures in a web of mutual dependence and shared destiny. As Colonel Whetfield's assault force advanced toward what they believed would be an easy victory, they had no idea that they were about to encounter powers that their rational minds could neither understand nor defeat.